Okay, sir. So now I'll be exiting from the teams from this meeting. Good luck all, and then looking forward for the talk. Thanks a lot.
Welcome everyone to the 8th lecture of the Mindsperm series, which seeks to bring education outside the four walls of a classroom and to keep the act of learning and curiosity alive and going in these times. Thanks to all of you viewers and subscribers who've really been sending a lot of messages and questions. And in fact, it was based on one of your suggestions that we called today's speaker, who's Professor Prem Kumar Vijayan. He's a professor in the Department of English in Hindu College at Delhi University. He has a PhD from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, the Netherlands. His thesis was recently published in a book called Gender and Hindu Nationalism, Understanding Masculine Hegemony by Routledge, New York. Professor Vijayan has written and published frequently on a variety of issues, including caste inequality, privatization of higher ed, state violence, corruption, terrorism, sexuality, etc. And that's actually, how I know him because I was a student back in the day when I was doing English literature. He taught me in Hindu college, and I fondly remember him for really opening up the idea of education for me. I remember somebody who just come out of the CBSE education system where innovation was out of the question. Professor Vijayan had once allowed me to do an assignment on Pink Floyd, and my mind was blown away that, wow, this is allowed inside a classroom as well. But more importantly, what I do remember him for and what I continue to appreciate him for is that he is a man who practices what he preaches. In academia, we have a big problem of dealing with very big and complicated ideas inside the classroom, which we often fail to translate outside in our real lives. But Professor Vijayan is an individual, a teacher who continues to inspire all his students and colleagues to break those bottlenecks and to continuously practice what we preach. So welcome, Professor Vijayan. It's a great honor to have you here live with us. Today, he's going to speak on the topic isolation and communication and how our emotions are changing in the current environment. So again, it's an honor to really have you here, sir, and please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anuj. It's a it's an honor to be here to speak to all of you, and thank you very much to Mindsperm for inviting me to give this talk. I'd like to begin by saying that I'm going to dedicate this talk, if I may, to an old friend of mine who is currently in prison. Also a colleague of us, a former colleague, Dr. G.N. Sai Baba, who was arrested almost exactly 6 years to the date in May 2014 under charges of being an urban Naxal and so on and so forth. And in some ways, much of my political work and my academic and theoretical work is very closely related to the ideas and concerns that he had. So I think it's very appropriate that he should be the person to be, dedicated in this talk. Now, I want to start by saying, we've all been talking or hearing stuff about how we're feeling imprisoned under these rather unfortunate times where we've been under lockdown, quarantined, many of us, and there's a mandatory isolation that's going on and so on. Now, one of the reasons why we feel this way is that perhaps it is not out of choice, it is because it has been imposed upon us. We didn't choose to self-isolate. With 4 hours notice, one fine day, we were told, just lock yourselves up at home. And the terms of that isolation were decided very much for us. So what are these terms under which we've been isolated? One, of course, we are all very familiar with this, but just to very quickly recap some of these, we've been cut off from any mode of transportation. There's at least in the early stages, there was simply no moving around at all. Now it's easing up a little. The very important and repeatedly, insisted upon idea of maintaining physical distance through the rather unfortunate use of the word phrase social distancing. but physical distance is what it actually amounts to. And of course, many of us in the middle class have also been complaining about having to do jharu pocha bartan kind of work, the routine housework which our domestic help used to do for us. So denial of services of various kinds. For some time, in fact, even online shopping and things that was, a big thing for middle class people had stopped completely. The fact that we had to be confined, not just not immobilized, but also confined in certain spaces. Some of us were quarantined, and not just by middle class, but anyone who was suspected of being COVID infected was quarantined as well. And very importantly, there's been a very steady insistence on observation and surveillance. In fact, the famous, infamous rather, Arogya Setu app that came out was brought out specifically with the objective of maintaining a degree of surveillance over the population. Granted that it was supposed to be for monitoring and tracking the movement of likely COVID infections. But as we've all been reading in recent times, there's a huge degree of concern about its invasion of privacy, and the way in which it is insecure in terms of the data that it keeps, also not quite appropriate in terms of the data that it accrues from us, right? And finally, there is perhaps the one that is most pertinent for us, the complete isolation from communication, except through beyond the immediate confines of our four walls. We are allowed to communicate only by either shouting across the road at each other or through the electronic media, right, and social media platforms. Now, with the exception of this last aspect of communication through social media, etc., all of these other terms also apply to imprisonment as well. And this is something that I'll return to later. In fact, both these points I will return to later. The other reason, that I wanted to talk about, the other reason I believe that we feel imprisoned is because isolation and forms of quarantining are usually also seen as penal actions, punishments, right? So the whole go to your room or go stand in the corner kind of punishment that we are taught to see as punishment as we experience from childhood, also has these aspects of denial, of surveillance, of confinement, etc., etc. So when we are confined in the four walls of our homes, or we are told that we are confined or we are isolated, we also experience this as a kind of punishment, and we balk. We say, what is this and so on. However, there is obviously a very major set of differences between imprisonment of this kind and self-isolation, right? Or in fact, there are three things. There's isolation, there's self-isolation, and there's imprisonment. So I'll just get the issue of self-isolation out of the way very quickly. Very obviously, in self-isolation, the primary point is that you are in fact in control. You retain agency, and you decide the terms on which you are withdrawing and you are isolating yourself. It is a mark, in fact, of your power. It is a mark of your self-reliance, your Atmanirbharta, as it is famously being used now. It tells people you don't need them, and this point is again something actually of some significance. We'll come back to this one as well later. But the difference between isolation and imprisonment is also that when you are imprisoned, you are told and everyone is told that you are imprisoned for the safety of others, right? Um, you are a threat to society. You are a danger to the world, and therefore you must be locked away. Um, the issue of confinement in this particular case, however, is seen as, except in the case of quarantining, where you are then again seen as a possible threat to society, but otherwise, you are told to stay. You are told to stay home to be safe. It is for your sake rather than for the world outside that you are told to stay at home. Um, then, of course, uh, the element of penalization is much more clearly spelt out in imprisonment. Uh, you are told not only that you are being put away for the safety of others, but that you are being penalized as a corrective measure. Now, uh, the question about, to what extent these corrective measures work has been long debated, and we won't get into that one. Um, it's not the point of what I'm focusing on here. Uh, but I want to talk briefly about how that correctiveness or correction is supposed to work, right? Now, most of us are quite familiar with the work of Foucault, who tells us that it is imprisonment is about governance, it's about control, it's about experimentation, it's about knowledge production, it's about production of the knowledge of the subject who is imprisoned, what he calls an orthopedics of individuality. That is, it's literally an engineering of the self that is undertaken under conditions of imprisonment. In the case of isolation under COVID, we can see that the corrective is supposed to be, to prevent the communicability of a disease, right? And it's important to remember that, in this context, that quarantining as a practice goes way back, right? It goes back to perhaps even um, uh, you know pre historic times. Certainly, we've got references to it in the Old Testament and so on. Lepers were quarantined; they had lepers colonies and so on. But quarantining as a political practice is something that emerges primarily in the 19th century at the peak of the imperial period, right? So that's something that also is worth bearing in mind when we think about these issues. The idea that diseases can be communicable and therefore need quarantining is again something that emerges primarily in the 19th century. And of course, in the case of imprisonment, especially of someone like, G.N. Sai Baba and the whole bunch of people who've been thrown into jail after that, whether it was, you know, Rona Wilson, or now it's um, uh, uh, I'm so bad with names. Um, Anantel Tumde and people. The the idea is that ideas can be communicable diseases too, right? So you have a diseased idea which needs to be isolated and which needs to be put away in jail. And if you wish, in one sense, this is the real virus. This is the virus that is in recent times um, seen as a threat and needs to be quelled. You also must remember that all states, regardless of their political affiliation, are designed to see their subjects as potentially insurgent, right? So just as all viruses see all human bodies as potential sources as potential hosts, and therefore all hospitals might see all human bodies as potential sources of diseases, so too all states tend to see all human beings, all their subjects, as potential sources of insurgency, and approach and for the most part, they approach the practice of governance from the point of view of controlling that potential insurgency. And so you have this series of linkages that you come up with, right? You have incarceration, quarantining, observation, surveillance, control of communication, and the production of the subjects. They are all interlinked, right? And this is one kind of production. There's another kind of production that I'll come to later, the more commonly understood way in which word production is understood. For now, we need to also talk about another kind of penalization that is happening simultaneously, and that is exclusion, right? Uh, so the penalization of imprisonment, the penalization, the felt penalization of self-isolation or isolation because of quarantining of this kind. Um, to these two, you can also add the penalization of exclusion. Now, uh, physical distancing is now an explicit form of social distancing as well. But who is excluded in this way? It's not just your neighbors or your friends. In fact, the really excluded right now are the vast masses of the poor, the migrant laborers, those without access to any kind of media or communication systems, certainly no access to the social media, and in other words, those without resources of any kind, the destitute. Now, in 2014, the University of Oxford conducted a study uh, in which it was found that India is home to the largest number of destitutes in the world, right? 28.5% of the Indian population at that time, 2014, was seen to be destitute. That's about 343 or 344 million people, right? And these are the people who are right now stranded. They're completely excluded from any sense of belonging or being part of this world of self-protection, of Atmanirbharta, right? They are literally left to their own self-reliance at this point. And of course, they are also in a position where they have nothing to be self-reliant on. We've seen pictures, we've seen videos of people bouncing upon bags of food and snatching, tearing at each other to get a little bit of food. I've seen videos of a man collecting milk that is spilt out of a milk van uh, um, from the streets as it's flowing down, and it's being licked by dogs. So we have these kind of conditions as well. And of course, people are uh, not actually doing anything to help him, because to help him would be to go near him, to touch him, and so on. And this is seen as a violation of the law, if you wish, right? Um, Now, why are they excluded? What is the form of exclusion that has happened here? It is not just that they are no longer part of the world of communication where we can talk to them or they can talk to us. It is that they have been excluded from production itself. Now remember that production in India of anything has pretty much come to a standstill. Not all economic activity, consumption goes on. We are, especially in the consuming classes, people who have the resources to continue to subsist. We continue to live off our earnings. We continue to buy stuff that is still available, that has been stored away. Of late, of course, some amount of production has begun of necessary essential goods and so on. But by and large, the vast industry, whether it is agricultural or industrial sectors, production has come to a complete standstill. And that means that the people who participate in that production for their livelihood, who literally are earning their day-to-day existence from the work that they do in the participation in that production, have have nowhere to go, right? So they have been excluded not just from consumption, but they have been excluded from production, and therefore from consumption, and therefore from production, and so on. So it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. So you might see the coming in of the COVID virus as a kind of um, like a demographic Occam's razor that has suddenly just cut through all the complexities of our society and made two uh, basic simple divisions, or rather one basic simple division with two halves. And there's the haves and there's the have-nots. Some people who have access to these resources and these communication possibilities and the ways in which to make themselves visible, and that vast population of people out there who simply aren't there. Um, so the word, the phrase self-reliance then becomes uh, somewhat bitter in this context. Um, so what then is being produced under these current circumstances? What is if other kinds of production have stopped, what else is being produced? Quite apart from the enormous number of lies that we're being told about everything under the sun, the what is also being produced is an extensive apparatus of personalized communication, right? Uh, we uh, have already seen how the electronic communication in the country has now become the monopoly, the duopoly of two major players, that is Jio and Bharti Airtel, and it's quite likely that it's soon going to become a monopoly. And the way in which they have pushed various ways of communication, of meeting, and so on and so forth is in fact actually the hard sell of a physical infrastructure to facilitate um, a particular kind of communication, right? Uh, Now, the point, of course, is that as we go further and further down this road, this becomes, if not the sole means, it becomes the primary means through which we relate to the world outside the home. Um, so what we see happening right now in as in the times that we're living is uh, a change in the very understanding of that old division of the public-private, right? Uh, we now see the sharpening of social divisions and social spaces being divided along the lines of safe and unsafe spaces. There's a new notion of a public sphere. The public sphere is no longer simply the physical space out there, it's a virtual public sphere, which I've talked about in some of my articles as well earlier. The public sphere that is pretty much hegemonized right now by a right-wing nationalist discourse. Um, and that virtual public sphere is also the virtual public sphere that we participate in every time we turn on our devices, and even now for that matter. So one that I asked Mindstorm people was, whether it would be okay for me to be a political speaker, and they told me, yes, of course, it's fine. And I'm grateful for that I can speak these things, and not that it's deterred me in the past, but hopefully some of these ideas can come out as a sort of counter voice to that hegemonic voice out there. So there is a certain notion of what it means to be a citizen, a subject, a public subject, uh, that has now blurred the boundaries of the public and the private, because it is now happening in the palm of your hand, in your device. It is coming, streaming to you. It is coming to you, of course, in the intimacy of your drawing room, of your television sets, and that is, as I said, the primary way in which one is relating to the world. Um, so the control of this idea of the public sphere uh, is is of course, it is effectively also a discursive space. It is a control of a discursive space. It is a control of an idea of what are safe and unsafe discourses, safe and unsafe ideas that can be put out there, right? Um, Now, it's important to understand here the momentousness of this transformation of what we're witnessing here, because if one of the major transformations that was taking place earlier was the feminist agenda of reclaiming that physical public sphere. We now find that this virtual separation of safe and unsafe spaces within the domestic space itself is one that is highly gendered, and it's violently gendered, as we've seen in recent reports. The um, the rise in cases of domestic violence in recent times has been phenomenal. In India alone, there's supposed to be a 50% rise in this period of lockdown, and I believe that's a very conservative estimate. In other places, in Australia, for instance, there's been a 70% rise in domestic violence. The people who control the the means of communication within these domains continue to remain the patriarchal head of the family. So, what constitutes safe for whom and in what ways, of course, now becomes a very important question. It's very important to understand within this context how our emotions and feelings are being reconstructed, are being restructured, if you wish. Uh, if you were to see a person physically, there are various what they call non-verbal clues, non-verbal forms of communication that happen, uh, including the perhaps the color of the skin, the the manner in which the person might touch you or the person might be touched, the smell of the person, which may be unconscious or conscious. All of these determine very much the ways in which we relate to the people around us. All of this very intimate way, the forms and bases of intimacy through which we relate to people at a very visceral level. These have, of course, been completely removed from the picture. Now we are our primary ways of relating and of conveying our emotions and feelings are through speech and sight. Right now, with the coming of 5G and with virtual reality technologies being pushed in a massive way, no doubt many of these will be further intensified, and you might get haptic facilities where you might actually get a sense of feel of the people that you're talking to and so on. But the point is that uh, in all of this, you participate in the creation of a reality, the terms of which are not decided by you, the interpretation of which is not decided by you, it is not in your hands. It is given to you by the infrastructure through which that communication has been mediated, right? Um, it can be, confined on the one side by the infrastructural, technologies that you have access to, and on the other hand, by something as silly, if you wish, or something as basic, if you take it more seriously, as the language of emojis and gifs and so on, which uh, are emerging as a sort of alternative way to communicate our sensibilities and our feelings and our emotions. But at the same time, precisely because they are, at this point at least, they exist in a very kind of rudimentary grammar. Uh, what we feel and what we express is substantially different from what we experience in our own minds, if you wish. And at the same time, because there is a constant need to reconcile that difference, we ultimately succumb to the meaningfulness of what is put forward in these in the terms that are provided for us, right? And we're doing this willingly, voluntarily, right? So memes, um, uh, emoticons, gifs, they constitute a new language, a grammar through which we try and communicate. Um, they are mediated by an infrastructure that is entirely, in somebody else's hands, in the hands of a corporate out there. And if we want to continue to participate in that, very often we are also obliged to undertake certain consumptive activities, like purchasing something, or becoming a member of something, or and so on and so forth, right? So this is a kind of echo chamber that is multiplied in its in the way in which it is impacting upon us, and without our realizing it, right? So we are now slowly getting into this enclosed space where at our most intimate levels of sense of self, or sense of identity, a sense of who we are and how we feel and how we relate to the world, are all being shaped, as it were, by this new language and these new media that we are being forced at one level through which to communicate, right? It's very reminiscent of the theory, which is still a very controversial theory, that the origins of writing were not in the need to record or to transmit or to communicate over long distances, but as part of an of a state need to audit and to control and to archive, and to identify, right? So this, when you tie this up with all the other ways in which apps like Arogya Setu work, or the Aadhaar program work, then we realize that these very social media through which we are working as mediated subjects in this virtual public domain create us as identities which can be archived. And we are now, in Jameson's rather serendipitous phrase, we are now in a prison house of a new language, right? And perhaps it's a language we don't even realize, and therefore we don't even realize what is this prison that we are in. So a long time ago, I wrote a phrase about, how if the government can't imprison everyone, then it will take the prison to everyone else, and that seems to be pretty much what is happening here. So going back now to the and literally, it is through your sense of self, through your sense of your emotions and your feelings, that the state can begin to exercise a control over you and over your sense of action, agency, right and wrong, etc. Going back now to the excluded, the marginalized, the people who are no longer a part of this echo chamber universe that we are inhabiting. The only way in which they can continue to participate in this process of production is by becoming part of that echo chamber. They must gain identities in the Aadhaar platform. They must self-identify through the Arogya Setu. Then they will be given certain benefits from the state if they do this, right? If they want to participate in the process of consumption, then they must participate in this process of the production of a virtual reality that is the world that we now are slowly, literally, willy-nilly manufacturing around us, right? If they want to participate in this in a more gainful way, they have to get an education from within this world. And hence, of course, there is this great push towards online education, towards privatization of education, which will facilitate online education. Um, and in order to participate in that online educational process, of course, they will have to again become e-subjects, as it were, right? They have to become members of this e-world, this echo chamber world, as well as an electronic world. Um, there is a sense in which all this is leading to a greater and greater uh, facilitation of the production of the cloud. Right now, we all know what the cloud means, but what we have now, or what we will be called upon to do more and more, especially through the very platforms that we are employing, right? Whether it's Facebook or Instagram or uh, you know WhatsApp or any of these other the media that we use, there is going to be an intensification of the usage of the cloud to store data, right? And less reliance on the internal memory of the the phone storage. So it's actually the very opposite of self-reliance, of Atmanirbharta, which we are um, uh, you know building towards, as explained by the PM. Um, so there is a greater and greater then surrender of our data to that world in which we participate in. And similarly, those who want to participate in that world uh, will have to be produced as subjects in that world through the production of this data about themselves, which will then be used by the various platforms, and they will of course sell it to corporates and so on and so forth. Right now, at some point, of course, apart from all this kind of production, we will have to, and we are going to, and we are probably already starting the process of um, the more fundamental production process, that is the production of essential items apart, but also cars and trucks and soaps and so on and so forth. But once we've ensured that part in production can happen only through participation in that virtual world, then even the participation of these workers in the world of production will be much more controlled. It will come under uh, the guidelines of safety and efficiency and so on, and more and more people will be separated into these categories of the haves and the have-nots. So then now basically what you have will be docile controlled subjects, literally controlled from the palms of their hands. And I want to read out a passage briefly, from Foucault uh, on policing, right? And he says in the 17th and 18th centuries, the word police signified a program of government rationality. Today we think of them as people in uniform, but in those days it was a program of government rationality. This can be characterized as a project to create a system of regulation of the general conduct of individuals, whereby everything would be controlled to the point of self-sustenance, Atmanirbharta, without the need for intervention, right? So you will effectively self-sustain your participation in this world and police yourself and so on, right? So these are the haves. The have-nots will be controlled through exclusion and invisibilization, and controlled and regulated access to the means of production, which is, of course, their means of sustenance and their means of sustenance. We've already seen this happening, initiated in the ways in which UP and MP, for example, have gone about attacking their labor laws, right? And this can very well be the beginning of a further process of regulation of labor. There are reports that 27.5 million youth, that is people within the age groups of 20 and 30, have lost their jobs in this lockdown period, right? These are government reports. So what the actual number is probably much more. And remember, there's always been a large number of people who have worked in the unorganized sector, and they have been particularly hit both by demonetization and now by this lockdown. So we're thinking actually in terms of a figure probably 3 or 4 times 27.5 million out there, the actual figures of destitute people who will be controlled by this by these new infrastructural regimes. I like to end by talking about with a reference to a very common, very popular motif in science fiction films, in particular the zombie. And we've all seen a whole lot of zombie apocalypse movies, right? And we see zombies primarily as people or not people who want to come eat us up. But one of the defining features of the zombie is that they cannot communicate. And what we're effectively doing is making zombies of ourselves and of this vast mass of excluded people who are hungry and who are destitute and who will want to survive, right? And perhaps, in a sense, art has predicted the reality in this way. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, sir, for that fantastic talk. We've had a whole range of questions coming in, but just want to take this moment to thank you for this. It actually felt like I was back inside the Hindu classroom and we were discussing all sorts of things. And what I remember once again fondly from those classrooms is the defamiliarization of reality that you used to do for many of the things that would seem natural, So many of the tropes that you spoke about, sitting here, using Zoom to conduct this session, sitting inside my room for a whole month, all of it has become naturalized for us over a course of time.
Absolutely.
And my big takeaway from your talk is for the importance for us to continuously defamiliarize ourselves from what seems to have been naturalized and to ask the kind of questions that you're doing. So thank you so much for tracing actually these kind of things that have been happening in the background, like even to think about how the wires and the electricity and the bandwidth that is coming, that is empowering this talk, comes from 1 or 2 big companies who are actually making a huge amount of profit during this time. So those kinds of things were very helpful. I'll try and quickly streamline the different thoughts, suggestions, and questions that have come from the audience. And I think one thing that has come very prominently from our viewers is to kind of ask you to think about, within this new kind of echo chamber reality that is emerging, how do you see, so you've traced out, you've kind of diagnosed the problem. We'd also like you to try and help us think about the cures possibly, in the sense of how do you think forms of protest or politics changing within this new regime of governmentality that is emerging in front of us?
Just this morning I was reading a news item about how a think tank called the RAND Corporation, you're probably all familiar with it, in the US, had brought out a report on how the Putin regime in Russia was getting away with telling lies, right? And how does one counter that? One is, of course, to be as vocal as you can and to keep calling out the lies. But one of the other suggestions that also came out from the article was to tell similar lies to put out as many counter lies as possible, so that it's the other side, as it were, will also have to deal with your lies, and it then becomes a kind of a battle of lies. I don't know how serious this person was, but it certainly seemed like a very, very counterproductive activity to me, primarily because effectively you're going to waste your time creating a whole bunch of confusion, which and making yourself highly doubtful as a source of reliable information and politics. But what one can do, moving slightly away from that, is, you see, one of the problems right now is that people are scared of dissent. People are scared to speak up because of what has been happening to dissenting voices. And even, my near and dear ones keep telling me, shut your mouth, and what's wrong with you? Why do you want to keep on putting yourself in danger?
Yeah.
And obviously that has an impact on me as well. And I'm wondering whether I'm doing the right thing or not. So I get the sense that there is an enormous sense of fear out there. So the first step, I think, is to build networks of reliable solidarities, right? And those reliable solidarities can't be simply from within this echo chamber. We have to make the effort to go out into the streets and get in touch with the people who are out there and suffering. Communicate with them the realities of what is happening. Help them to help us also shape programs and activities through which, because ultimately they are the source of any change that is going to happen. You cannot change this echo chamber from within it. It's going to be very, very difficult to do that, right? Partly because the power of the echo chamber is so intrusive, intimate, and all-encompassing, if you wish. So you need to find ways to get. I can't really say I have any answers, but I can suggest that some methods that we need to adopt. We need to break out of reliance on this echo chamber. Firstly, we need to start communicating outside, and from within it, we need to start building networks and solidarities, which can actually form a kind of barricade to this intrusion on our lives. Right. So perhaps in a more creative way, alternative platforms of social media and so on.
Yeah, I think that's the layer of thinking that we all need to do at the moment, because when I think about the forms of collective action that most people are familiar with, a lot of them have such haptic imagination, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Holding hands together, or the famous slogan ki awaaz do hum ek hain, like your voice and all mixing together, or the physical bodily act of going and kind of protesting in front of a body. All those metaphors and all those bodily forms of voicing dissent, I think, have been rendered useless in the current environment because of the fact that you could potentially catch the virus if you engage in those forms of activities. And you gesture towards how other forms of bodily sensations are being heightened. So the sight and speech is heightened, and you also gesture towards how potentially virtual reality in the future could capitalize on haptic sensations as well.
Yeah.
May I request you to indulge in some speculation about how you see the bodily experience of protest changing in these new regimes and new worlds?
I can at best be speculative.
Exactly.
Right? But my suggestion would be to steer clear of all kinds of VR activity, firstly, because that actually colonizes the mind, it colonizes the imagination, and it restructures, it rewires the neurons. Literally, I mean, these are studies that I've done, that have actually studied how these things work. Right. And so it's not just about a kind of ideological change; it's an actual neurological change that happens. It's recreating you as a neurological subject. So it's best to just, it's like taking a drug, it's best to just stay away from these kind of things. Secondly, I think it's very important to actively, if not put lies out there, that's our idea, but certainly I think to start undermining the platforms that you use,
Hmm.
um, uh, constantly self-reflexively question the ways in which they work, question the information that they put out, uh, and as far as possible, ensure that you know new ways of imagining social contact, social communication can be created. Uh, Very simply, I think once it is possible to do so, perhaps it might not be a bad idea to hold a rally maintaining physical distance.
Hmm.
You know, um, if you're complying with that idea of physical distance, both for your own sake and for the sake of following the law, um, there's absolutely no harm in actually, holding a public protest. And in all probability, it'll look much larger than it actually is because you have people standing in these separated lines. So
Right.
uh, I think we need to be more creative about the way in which we imagine how to relate physically with each other. And I think we're still too caught up in the old ways, me myself included. So
Yeah. Yeah. All of
uh,
us.
we need to actively work towards those alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And there's one other thing that I would like you to help us think through. So, I mean, a pandemic, a virus has come into the human ecosystem and has created all sorts of havocs. It's more importantly, it's instead of creating new kinds of divisions or new kinds of abnormalities, I think I read somewhere which was beautifully put that it's actually revealing contradictions that have always existed within our social systems. So it's almost like a de-ideologizing, defamiliarizing kind of virus that's opening up these contradictions that were
Mm.
already there. And these possibilities to also reimagine the world are emerging. How do you think we can optimize these possibilities that are emerging to change the ways in which we understand the normal and the social?
You know, if you go back to the 14th century and the way in which people dealt with the plague,
Right,
um, one of the most important developments in those times was the wearing of a mask.
right,
And it's a kind of new medievalism that we see now, except that it's not that hawk mask that indicated that you are uh, sort of infected by the plague, but you have a mask. Um, I think the lesson from that is that we need to understand that our notions of normalcy, our notions of reality, our notions of uh, social reality
hmm,
are all now going to be substantially overturned,
yeah,
right? And when that happens, we also need to be very careful about um, receiving the new ideas of normalcy and reality and social reality and so on, precisely because, as I said, we are in an echo chamber, and that those ideas are coming from a particular place, and they have a particular objective.
right,
So we need to question. We need to be very, very diligent in our uh, questioning of what we are receiving as the norm.
hmm,
Uh,
yeah,
what what constitutes uh, uh, the the new norm uh, might not be anything we can recognize today, right? But I think it's also important to question the idea of having a norm at all, and to ask the role, ask of ourselves, what is the role that a norm plays in our lives? Um, why do we need to have a sense of normalcy um, if we want to conduct a social relation in the first place?
right,
Uh, the opposite of normalcy in this sense is not chaos. It's not abnormalcy. It is a sense. It is rather a sense of critique. The ability to be able to see things as given to us rather than things as we would like to negotiate at an interpersonal level. And I think one of the great things that we can take away from this current situation is that it has opened the possibility for that interpersonal negotiation to happen outside of the echo chamber. But we need to be able to break that echo chamber enough to get there. I mean, that's really the only sort of rudimentary response I can make at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, Professor, some of our audiences are very interested in the final thought at which you finished your talk, which was conversation about zombies, because it connects to the pop cultural interest that many of our viewers have. So could you spend some time elaborating on that particular strain within your thinking? How does the zombification of reality
But
connect to your argument?
it's a long pending paper, so I think I'll have to leave the details of that particular thing to that paper. But in short, what I've been thinking about for a long time now is that, what is the figure of the zombie, and where does it come from?
Right.
It didn't come from the third world imagination. It didn't come from um, uh, the African imagination. It didn't come from the South American imagination. It came from, and it's a completely new figure. If you think in terms of figures of horror,
Right.
it is very much a modern, even a postmodern monster, if you wish, right? So it's an industrially produced, if you wish, monster figure. And the zombie never exists in isolation. The zombie is always a herd. The zombie is, in my opinion, it was a metaphor for the third world, from the first world, from the gated communities of the first world, to see how the immigrant crisis is reflected in the imagination of the zombie constantly trying to enter into the world of the haves, as it were. Um, at the same time, the zombie is, as I said, more importantly for us right now, the zombie is a figure who can't communicate. The zombie is speechless. The zombie doesn't have any sense of a society. Nevertheless, the zombie herds together, right? And that's the paradox of the zombie. In every zombie picture that you see, whether it's I Am Legend or the Alice, what's it called? Uh, what's that series in which you have the protagonist is called Alice?
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, never mind. I think I'm sure your listeners will
Yeah.
know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The Walking Dead is another one.
Yeah.
Of course, going back to Shaun of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead and so on and so forth. So a whole bunch of these films, which are basically about figures who are suddenly deprived of sustenance and who are
Right.
dying to eat. And what they eat is the human body itself. They cannibalize, and the metaphor of cannibalism is particularly interesting because it is a cannibalism that comes from lack of communication. It is a cannibalism that emerges out of the failure of communication. You cannot communicate to the zombie. You cannot communicate the
Right.
wrongness of cannibalism to the zombie, and therefore the zombie becomes a cannibal. So yeah, these are some of the thoughts that I've been sort of playing with, and I will at some point put down and hopefully publish.
That really sounds fascinating, sir. I had once again not thought about zombies like this. I think the common strain of this talk, as well as many of your lectures, has been to defamiliarize that which seems commonsensical, the normal, and the popular, to constantly question and kind of unscrew
Yeah.
these normalcies and to look at it from all over. So, thank you so much for taking out the time for speaking to our viewers. It was a wonderful experience listening to all that you had to say. Finally, thank you to all the viewers and the audience members who joined this 8th lecture of Mindsperm. Thank you so much for the Mindsperm team who's been working behind the stage to make sure that every Saturday we have these wonderful moments of defamiliarization, where we get to question the norms that have been established around us. To all of those who have joined us, please follow, like, and subscribe Mindsperm on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and please feel free to send in suggestions about what kind of talks, what kind of speakers you'd like us to bring on. I'd also like to give a shout out to Mindsperm's social partner, Sangh COVID-19, which is an initiative started by the YF batch of 2020 at Ashoka University, which is collecting funds, which is trying to reach out to the ones who have been excluded, as Professor Vijayan spoke about, to do whatever little they can by providing basic amenities, groceries to the needful families. Perhaps Sangh too, after this talk, can kind of take this point that apart from providing groceries and basic amenities, the larger task that all of us also have is to kind of try and cultivate a critical consciousness, both between ourselves as well as the ones who we're trying to reach out to. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Vijayan, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you to you and to Mindsperm.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you
Bye.
all.